Affordability is front and center in Washington, D.C. right now, especially after President Trump's meeting with New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani last week. But our next guest says that despite this renewed focus, affordability is a problem that just can't be solved. Greg Ip is the Wall Street Journal's deputy economics editor and chief economics commentator. Steve Leisman, by the way, is back with us for this conversation as well. But Greg, welcome. It's good to see you this morning. Your column gets at a really interesting idea. Affordability is something amorphous. You can't measure it the same way you can inflation. It's kind of how people feel. And as a result, that makes it incredibly difficult to try and solve.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is one of the things I found interesting about Mamdani's run for a New York mayor, which was highlighted at that meeting Friday. I mean, he did more than anybody else to put the word affordability on everybody's lips. And now everybody's talking about affordability. If you do kind of like a Google trend search, you'll see that that number really erupted in interest just in the last year. But what I find interesting, like as an economics guy, is that there's nothing in the data that tells us affordability has gotten notably worse in the last year. It's more or less been the same trend as the year before. And this got me to thinking that really affordability, it's as much a state of mind as it is an economic condition. People are just in a situation right now where they really, really focus on the things that are getting harder to control. You know, a year ago it was eggs. Well, eggs are down in price now. Now it's beef. We just had a government shutdown. That was all about health insurance affordability. And Becky, it kind of leads me to believe that as long as people are in this stressed state of mind, there will always be an affordability crisis. And whether you're Mamdani or Trump, you don't really have a magic key that solves it.
I mean, this was something the Biden administration faced for a long time. And by the way, inflation was much higher under the Biden administration. But their way of trying to calm people down was to say, it's not that bad. Things are getting better here. Inflation's coming down here. Prices for this are coming down. President Trump can point to things like oil prices coming down. But as you point out in your column, electricity prices are higher. And then if you look at mortgage rates, that is a real issue for anybody who's trying to buy a house and trying to get into something. If your mortgage is set and you have it set from a long time, you're not feeling that pinch. But there are a lot of places in the population where that pinch comes up. And it doesn't work to say, hey, actually, the numbers show this if people feel like they are feeling additional pain.
Right. Now, I just want to sort of set the record straight. Biden never went around saying there's no inflation. It's all in your mind. Over and over, he and his folks would say, we've brought the rate of inflation down. It was 9%. It's now 3%. That's what it was when he was
right. But that's what I mean. Telling
term.
People inflation is not as high as you think it is. It's come down. Doesn't work if people feel like they're paying all the time. This is the same thing that the Trump administration is facing right now, too.
Right. And Trump, unlike Biden, goes around saying there's no inflation. He says it over and over again. He called the affordability crisis a con job. So much more than Biden, he's frustrated and arguing with people telling them that what they see and think isn't really true. But I think the broader issue, Becky, is that it doesn't really matter what the president says. People are going by their own sort of lived experience. Steve,
what do you think about all of this?
Well, a couple things. First of all, this idea has been out there for a while. It was kind of interesting to me. We've been polling on this affordability issue for a long time and finding that it is a big deal. In fact, it cuts across parties. In our third quarter poll, you can see when we ask, are prices rising faster than usual? Even 18% of Republicans, which is a big number, think it's a problem. Obviously, there's a political dynamic to it, more Democrats than Republicans, but follow the independents there. One issue that's out there that's a big pressing concern when it comes to affordability is health care, and that's a real issue. That's not a perceived issue. That's not eggs, and that's not milk, and that's not beef. That's health care. And you can see the percent who are unsatisfied. A big percentage by party, according to our poll. So that's a big issue. So part of it is perceived, part of it is real. What people don't seem to get, it's the really hard economic idea that prices can go up, but they don't necessarily come back down. What's supposed to happen is incomes need to rise to the price level. And they've been doing that, by the way. What you don't want falling prices. And the reason you don't want it is because if your prices are going down, your income is going down. And I'll just add one more thing. A very slight disagreement I have with Greg is one place where you can, as a government, have an effect on affordability is through your antitrust and your monopoly enforcement. And that is an issue, I think, where we could have some, discovery of whether or not there's some pricing stickiness or inelasticity in the economy that might be the result of monopolies, at least local ones.
What do you
Yeah,
think
I
about
mean,
that? Okay.
well, yeah, I find it fascinating that after Trump heard all these complaints about the price of beef, he announced he ordered like an investigation into price collusion or anti-competitive behavior by beef companies. You know, this sounds very much like what Biden and Harris were doing like a year or two ago, right? I mean, it's not my imagination. So, you know, Steve, you're right. I'm sure there are areas where monopolistic power does raise prices, but let's say in a perfect world, those areas were solved. Would it affect the overall price level? I'm doubtful. I mean, you pointed out the health insurance
Well,
issue
Greg,
yourself. The price of health insurance is going up because health insurance is getting more expensive and because subsidies that were implemented in 2021 are going away. That's not a monopolistic competition issue.
it's interesting to me, Greg, that as we went through the inflation of the pandemic, corporate profits did not suffer. They found the ability not just to raise prices to meet input prices, but raise them further. So I'm interested in that dynamic. I'm not calling it a monopoly. I'm just saying that I was surprised to see how well profitability on Wall Street. And that's why I think one of the things, Wall Street's not concerned about inflation right now. If you get a Fed chair who's going to sit there and going to press on the accelerator, I think the Wall Street feels prices will just rise and profits will keep going.
I mean, you might be right. I'll point something else out, Steve, which I don't think many people have picked up on. It's precisely because the pandemic enabled companies to basically raise prices and then keep those margins. It's one of the reasons they've been able to absorb Trump's tariffs in the last year without raising prices so much. Right. So a lot of companies have basically decided to eat those thanks to the very nice profit margins they built up following the pandemic. And to your point, I think earlier when you were discussing today's data, I think that, again, you really need to disentangle the inflation issue from the affordability issue. Because as you yourself said, we've gotten pretty good news on inflation, and the bond market isn't terribly worried about inflation for that reason. But that seems to have had no effect at all on people's moods or attitudes about affordability. And that's going to be the challenge for Trump. And I don't think just putting Kevin Hassett, or anybody else for that matter, at the Federal Reserve solves that.
Hey, guys, I will add to that, like just trying to tackle housing prices and the affordability issues there. You can say it's higher interest rates, and certainly that's the case since post-2008 that we have seen. We've gotten used to these incredibly low mortgage rates. But if you talk to anybody who's actually involved in what it means, what goes into the home prices, they will also tell you that the biggest issue is the increase on construction prices. That, you know, it's the labor that goes into it, the materials that goes into it. All of those things that are kind of still snaking through the pipeline. And by the way, tariffs don't help on those issues either.
Well, that's true, Becky, but just a few facts for context. First of all, construction prices, they have gone up, but they've more or less gone up at the same rate as everything else, you know, and everything else went up. So I'm not sure that explains why housing would be more expensive than anything else right now. Second of all, the price of a new home, which is where you would expect to see construction prices be the most relevant, have actually been coming down in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think I read somewhere recently that the ratio of the new home to an existing home price is actually back down to its record low. But you made a point, Becky, which I think is so important. People got used to the 3 to 4% mortgage rates that we had in the decade before the pandemic. But that was really abnormal. That was because we were in a period of very low inflation, depressed conditions, and the Fed doing a lot of funky stuff like quantitative easing. And people who only grew up in that period thought that was normal, but it wasn't. I was really struck. I examined the National Association of Realtors Affordability Index. And this is a formula that incorporates people's incomes and mortgage rates in the price of homes. It's definitely the case that affordability is a lot worse now than it was before the pandemic, but it's roughly back to where it was before 2008. So again, this is not much comfort if you're one of those people who's unfortunately out there trying to buy a house for the first time. But what we're seeing on affordability is not crazily out of line with history.
No, but the problem that comes from this, there are two issues. With housing, it's the biggest part of most people's pay. So if your housing goes up by 5%, that's a much bigger hit than if your dining out bill goes up by 5%. The other issue is if beef prices go up, you can switch to chicken. If egg prices go up, you can do without eggs. If housing prices go up, there's not a whole lot you can do to diversify or say, I'm going to substitute with something else.
Well, there's always igloos, Becky. I think you're not really thinking about the full spectrum of one thing I know the Fed is concerned about, Becky, that's worth talking about and throwing into this conversation. If rates do come down, mortgage rates do come down, that saving on the rate just ends up in the price of the house because in many markets, not all of them, obviously, you have a lack of housing. And so in that situation of a lack of supply, you end up raising prices. So there could be actually an inflationary effect over some period of time from lowering rates because it ends up in higher housing costs.
That's interesting.
Right. So I think the one thing that almost everybody agrees with, and I certainly do, is that regardless of what's going on with construction prices and mortgage rates, there's a lot local and state governments can do to basically improve the supply of housing just by reducing regulations. And one of the things that I'll be watching closely is that there were a bunch of ballot initiatives that were approved in New York City, for example, at the same time that Mamdani won election. And the effect of these is to significantly reduce the barriers to building new developments in a lot of neighborhoods. That's the sort of thing that all the smart folks have been saying telling us all along is what you need to do to generate more development and more units. It's not going to solve a problem with housing prices in New York or anywhere overnight. But if enough cities and enough states do, and if they stick with the program, I think it'll make a difference over the medium term.